This is TWiT.
Android's accessibility API, you may have realized this over the past couple of years, has been used to do a lot of very unique and interesting things on the operating system over the years. Examples, password management, LastPass for one. They would use that accessibility API to overlay and insert passwords into the fields. Floating bubbles, I believe, were part of that. Certain tasker activities, Greenify. There's a whole bunch of apps that thrive because they have access to this API. Well, Google Play Store team recently emailed developers to say they must follow Google's guidelines for that API if they are to use it. And a lot of these apps, they're using this not necessarily the way it was intended, not the way it was designed. This API is really geared for improving usability on the devices for people who might have different usability or disabilities that would prevent them from using their phone in the same way that everybody else would. So either vision or a whole lot of different functionalities within the API. But developers have been kind of repurposing this and using it in a different way. So this could affect the way a lot of top-tier apps work. Could also be, by the way, and I think this is probably the reason that they're doing it, I would guess, is that it could be used for keylogging. It can be used for nefarious purposes because a lot of times it means putting an overlay on top of what you see, kind of intercepting taps, showing you different things than what's underneath it. So that might be a big driver for this. Google says developers must remove this permission within 30 days, and failure in that will result in app removal. So, I mean, is it, Juan, what do you think? Is it right of Google to suddenly crack down on this, or do you think Google needs to also realize that there are apps that are doing interesting things with this API, even though it's not by the book, it still makes Android better?
Don't we get the sense that Google's a little less interested in what developers are doing to make Android more interesting? I think we've been seeing Google kind of make a pivot towards trying to kind of button up some of the issues that we've had with Google, like in how updates are rolled out, how security patches are rolled out. And I think one of the ways that we're gonna see that is by kind of closing up some of these issues. I mean, I know in the XDA article they said, well, LastPass probably isn't going to be affected, but that was a part of Oreo, was getting these types of password managers integrated into the OS in a way that was sort of properly secured, not through some sort of, I don't want to use a word like misuse, but creative use of an API. I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of this head-to-head developer versus Google kinds of interactions as Google themselves are trying to make the play directly to consumers with their own products, and then sort of reining in what manufacturers can do with Android. I think it only makes sense that we're going to also see them start reining in developers on what they can do with Android.
Yeah, what do you think, Flo?
I don't think it's a developers versus Google situation at all. I think it's just Google trying to ensure that it's a smooth experience for everyone, ensure that those features are being used for what they are meant for, which is for people who need that extra feature on their Android interface. I mean, I was reading a couple of just takes on Twitter about from various people just who mull about Android stuff, and a lot of them were saying along the lines of just it's not like anti-developer, it's more pro-user, because it makes in the end it makes things safer. And
yeah, how does Google know on an app-by-app basis when they're asking for permission or access to this API? How does Google know from its perspective that the developer that is requesting this access outside of their guidelines is doing it to present something that's useful to a user versus doing it because they have nefarious, ideas for how to intercept or keylog?
Yeah, and I don't mean that I think Google's going to go after developers, but I mean, exactly to your point, Flo, because I completely agree, is the sense that a vast majority of people are probably interacting with Android in a very specific way. And that means a tiny minority of people are going to be affected by these types of security policies. Like I've got a couple of friends that are really into Tasker. If Tasker is crippled in any way, they're going to be very upset. But they represent such a small piece of the overall Google pie, the Android pie, that we really do need to talk about Android as a consumer-facing product. You want to make sure that more people are protected. And unfortunately, that will mean stepping on some toes.
I agree. I
Android
think
pie.
what they might be doing is, I'm assuming maybe LastPass got through, that Google they just have a team of people who are curating what the apps are doing. I imagine, this is an interesting dance, because we're basically talking about this store that's super open, like becoming more and more closed, and that within itself creates issues, because like that's hugely against the philosophy.
Maybe the legacy.
The legacy, that's the perfect word. It's the legacy of the Play Store, that it's just this open marketplace. But for Google to really become this like consumer powerhouse, it needs to put those protections in place the way that Apple has in the iTunes, or in the now Apple App Store. Protecting people from there being too many fart apps is like, it is a consumer protection in its own way.
No such thing as too many fart apps.
Because the thing is when you have lack of quality, that eventually permeates like through other avenues. And I mean, you are the company that you keep, okay, ladies and gentlemen. So if you're keeping bad apps around, you're keeping that company and emboldening that kind of company. And you don't want that around these parts. You want a nice, smooth experience.
Mm-hmm. That's true. Well, and that's been Google's big trend, and what they've been going towards. You know, and the Pixel devices is just one example of that. They're definitely kind of moving towards the Apple model,
and
let's say,
offering exclusives,
which is going to upset a lot of Android faithful.
But I don't even think it's necessarily moving towards the Apple model. Just Google taking more ownership of their product.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
And if you want to like go out of the box, that's still available to you. There are still forums out there. There's still ways that you can go and do things. And maybe in the end, Tasker is gonna be crippled. But is that gonna matter for, someone like my mom who has the money to spend on these things?
Or maybe what Google can also do, and I'm sure they're thinking about this also, is realize that developers are coming up with very interesting things to do with these devices. This API, as one example, is helping to facilitate that. Maybe this API isn't the right way to do that, but maybe Google realizes that there's opportunity to add, in its own controlled way, some official way for some of these things to happen, and control it that way.
And in that case, then I think Google has a better opportunity to properly disclose when an app is calling that information, which I don't believe you do have using the accessibility API in this fashion. Like, why are you calling this piece of information, or why are you granting access to this part of the underlying structure? I can hope that, like what they did with password management, that they can eventually roll those kinds of services out to developers looking at more advanced customization sort of behind the scenes.
Yeah. There we go. Boom. We solved it.